Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. I'm George Binns, and this evening I want to talk a little bit about diversity, equity, inclusion, and a new phrase in there, belonging. And to help us understand it, who better than the new director of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, Wangari Fahari.
Yes.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me, George.
Well, you've been on the job, I guess, as we were talking earlier, 2.5 months?
2.5 months
So
coming in.
you're in a stage right now of understanding what the situation is, and have had several discussions with Dr. Andre Morgan about the similar position in the school system. And I guess my first inkling is, how is this different than the schools? How does the city have a diversity issue or situation when we've got essentially a fixed demographic? Everybody knows how many people of different ethnic backgrounds are around. What is it a problem? Is there something we can do about it?
That's a really great place to start. And to looking at the schools in the city, I like to differentiate it in terms of the schools deal with different access barriers than the city in general. So the way that Dr. Anna Morgan and I can best support each other is not just exchanging metrics and data as well as resources. It's also supporting each other because we are one team departments. And even though it's not typical for the student DEI and the community DEI to work together in Beverly, we are doing our best to support each other when needed. Mm-hmm. In terms of demographics in Beverly, I don't think we have a problem. I think what we are looking at is to be more mindful of what we have, being able to assess needs, barriers, but also identifying what those demographics are and what we could do better to engage further so that we can make sure that everyone is being met and that all needs are being met and all the taxpayers are happy. And also, if there are needs, for example, right now we're looking for ASL translation to be more inclusive. It's very helpful to have that kind of diversity as well in terms of disabilities and being inclusive. And in terms of diversity, it's not always similar characteristics. It's also the diversity within the majority, but also the diversity that could come in with minority groups or socioeconomic characteristics as well.
Well, I guess diversity is I have a fundamental problem with the new vocabulary, because to me diversity means you got a bunch of different things.
Yes.
And when you're talking about people, we're really talking about different ethnic groups.
Correct.
And
other things.
Other things.
Yeah.
And when you start to get into the issues more of about equity, equity now means, when I was growing up, equity means how much of the value of your house do you own? How much of the mortgage is paid off?
Yes.
And now equity means equal outcomes. How do you have an equal outcome in a city?
Yes. So just to backtrack a little bit, to explain diversity further, is I think the simplest way is looking at the similarities and also the differences. So as we look at the similarities and the differences, we also acknowledge the complexity of the combinations of other things. So it could be ethnicity, it could be socioeconomic, it could be race, it could be sexual orientation. And I think that's when diversity becomes infinity, literally. Yeah. So it could be endless because you're not just thinking about having diversity in our workplace or in our schools in terms of minorities being able to have access to Beverly, but also we are starting to look at our visually impaired and also our covered veterans. Are they feeling included? Do they have someone that they can go to? So that's the way I look at diversity. But also, if you look at it in terms of programming, so my past work that led me into this position is in arts and culture. If you look at our Arts Fest, when we start looking at diversities, the struggles, let's say, Beverly Main Street faces when they're trying to bring programming to Beverly, and all of a sudden you start to see where the community is needing diversity versus it being a problem or something that we need to fix. It's meeting the need of the majority, needing to have more diversity, more ethnic experiences, and not having to drive to Boston. Kind of like pickleball.
Yeah.
Like, it's bringing that to our city and not feeling like we have to get on the highway and go to Denver's. And that touches on diversity for our older community. The needing them at their need is saying, okay, we need to diversify our courts and not just have it be tennis. We need to think about all the different generations and their needs, especially when it comes to mental health. So how that becomes inclusion, each city is different, and so would be each school. So the way, let's say, Beverly High School would approach inclusion maybe is not the way my office is. But inclusion for me becomes that moment of realization, like when I realized that I wanted to accept this position because I was mindful of the need. First of all, I'm married to a Caucasian man, so we have very deep conversations. I run a label where my audience is 98% white, so I have spent a lot of time really connecting with the majority and minority in a way that inclusion for me became, oh, how are we actually thriving? This is thriving because we are mindful of each other's backgrounds.
Well, when you start to get into inclusion and belonging,
Yeah.
you're now starting to talk about essentially smaller groups within the city. And the classic example for me is I'm a veteran. I did 2 years in the Army.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm what they refer to as the Cold War warrior. When I was in, everything was calm and peaceful. And my tour was to Fort Hood, Texas. That's as far as I got. But I can't join the VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, because I was never in a foreign war. So you run into situations like that. This happens in lots of different places where you have a group that's established, got a certain criteria for membership in that group,
Correct.
and not everybody is eligible, can ever possibly be eligible. So you've got that kind of situation
Yes.
around. There's lots of variations on it.
Yeah.
That's just a simple example that's very definitive. But it's the same thing with being a veteran. Okay, if you're a veteran, okay. But if you're a Marine, oh, that's something different.
Yes.
So that's another exclusive group within a bigger group that there's no way I can ever get into that because I'm Army. So I'm not a Marine. So it's a different, so I'm excluded from that automatically.
Yes. I understand.
But at the same time, should that be a problem or not? Mm-hmm. And we can get other generalizations of this.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
how do you get around this kind of thing? Or at what point do you say that, hey, that's just the way it is?
Yeah.
And
Yes. I think the first thing is what you just shared is so common right now. An example is skills and drills for high school students. You can't just play sports because you have the determination. You need to actually have the skills so that you don't injure your body.
Yeah.
So there are limits for inclusion depending on the policies and procedures of that department. So in sports specifically, when does inclusion become harmful? So if the child is being included but doesn't have the skills and they end up getting hurt, that's not good. So I always look at inclusion with the lens of how is this for the better good of not only the individual but the greater community. Mm-hmm. So one thing that I have been talking about in the faith aspect is there's so many different faiths that are around, and when you look at the multi-faith coalition, for example, there could be other groups that want to join that are not necessarily compatible. How is that space becoming inclusive? And when is it now it's no longer just inclusive, it's gone past the common good of what is it that the coalition was trying to achieve in the first place? So what I say to all the units and all the systems is, if you're feeling a need for inclusion and there's voices that are coming saying we're not being included, you might want to ask what they're going to bring in that you don't already maybe have, or what is the good that they're bringing in. And then by keeping them out, are you doing something good, or is it not necessarily important that you exclude them because it's more harmful than if you just include them in the first place?
Well, if you take your example of sports a little further,
Yeah.
excuse me, the reason you're playing sports is the camaraderie of being on a team, the physical exercise, the challenge of playing the sport, and there are a lot of fundamentals that apply to many different sports.
Yes.
And you can get this same set of gratifications, if you want to call them that, or satisfactions from different ones. And a classic example is the explosion of pickleball.
Yeah.
Again, it's a reasonably challenging activity. I notice at the Y, there are essentially two groups. There's a group that plays at the Sterling Center, and there's another group that plays up the hill at the Youth Center. Well, one group is much more challenging than the others, and pretty soon some people figure out that I'm not going to have much fun,
Yes.
or I'm not prepared yet
Yes. Yes.
to play at this level, but I can learn up there.
Yes.
And eventually you can get to the point of saying, hey, that's good enough, or hey, now I'm ready for the big time.
Yes.
So I can see in the sports analogy how you can have a variation and how you can satisfy needs.
Yes.
But when we start to talk about the art community, for instance,
Yeah.
I'm not sure how you do that.
Yes. I think if I look at the
Or you get to this faith-based group too.
yes. These are very mindful things, and I'm starting to learn that there's such a spiritual connection to DEI work that maybe not every other DEI practitioner considers, but personally I see a very deep spiritual thing. One way I could share is I've seen what diversity has done also to my friends that are in the majority group that are older. So one of my friends grew up in beautiful Palo Alto, California, when they had this 8-bedroom mansions that are gone. So it came as the diversity increased in California, and they were building much taller buildings. And so we need to all be conscious of what diversity means, and by moving forward, being aware that this is good. These are great choices that are universally going to benefit all of us. Like I always give the example of through encouraging our cities to have the curb cuts so that you're able to access our sidewalks with wheelchairs. I always say that is also really good for the mothers. And I see diversity as being beneficial for the greater good. Yes, there are a few people that will feel that these traditions that we have loved, that we have valued, are being threatened, or my history of the America that I grew up in. That is something that I really value, because my dear friend actually cried, and she's not racist in any way. These are real feelings that are going through the heart of America. And if we do not address that, and that's, I think, the part that personally as the DIB director for a city, I value that, and I want to have those conversations to make sure that as we are moving, and that's a spiritual aspect, as we are moving, that we are mindful of the allocation And that comes from the person receiving and the person giving, and how we are sharing, and how we making sure that the community that is sharing feels that they're not being taken advantage of, that there is what's in it for me as well on both ends, and not making those conversations abnormal. It's like normalizing those conversations and saying, okay, this is becoming an agreement, a partnership. So let's put everything on the table. So that's why I thank you so much. First of all, for serving, and also for inviting me, and because I'm curious to see what the policies are as well of the veteran community, and I'm looking forward to connecting with our Beverly veteran community as well. So,
Well, you raised an important word, mindful. I think a lot of the situation is people really don't understand what the problem is from the other side.
yeah,
And a lot of it is what is their perception? Because all these problems, I think, to me, are just us versus them. And there's a lot of ways to identify them. And you get into a lot of conversations, and as we were talking the other night at the library, we have a lot of different people of different backgrounds and have, in my case, a different set of vocabulary that I grew up with.
yes,
And now I'm finding out that, oh, you can't use that word anymore, and you can't use this word anymore. In some cases, I'm just not clever enough to say that, oh, yeah, that's one of the forbidden words. Now I got to use another one. And one of the problems that I see is showed up recently in the Boston Globe. They were talking about Mayor Wu having sent the troops out to clean out Mass and Cass and tear down all the tents and just clean out that homeless station. And part of the solution to the homeless problems is the Boston Globe said they're not homeless anymore, they're now unhomed.
or unhoused. They say unhoused as well. Yes. Yeah.
And that's nice. We don't have a homeless problem. We got an unhomed problem we don't talk about much. But the situation remains the same. And I get concerned that there's a lot of vocabulary changes being made
Yeah.
to gloss over a problem, and we just say, oh, we solved that problem. We don't have, and you can go back to kids in school with the learning problems, and they used to be retarded, and then it got to be an insult. Hey, you're a retard. Oh, can't use that anymore. And it keeps going on and on.
Yes.
And we keep cleaning up the language,
Correct. Yeah.
but the problem's still there. And
Yes.
as you mentioned earlier, there's a fundamental situation that there's not much housing at a reasonable price in Beverly.
Yes. Yes. Definitely. I think language is the key element right now of DI work. I think language is not just the responsibility of Beverly. I feel like it's something we're doing in a world capability. English is a very young language, and I think that we are having the opportunity to evaluate the words that were there during a time where not everybody had equal rights. So, for example, I'm going to use an example of growing up in Kenya. If you had a child with disabilities, they were never seen. So I would not know until maybe my mother sent me to her friend's house to deliver something. Then I was in their home and I realized, oh, I didn't know your brother had disabilities. So we've come far in Kenya, but still not as close as where we are in the United States. But for the United States, that we've taken care of so many things, and I think language is becoming the most important, because now we can do even more, which is how is my intention impacting someone? So my intention is to address the unhoused issue, but when I say homeless, it's not fully, let's say, correct, because they are home, they live in Boston, and they feel home and they belong in Boston, they just don't have a house.
Yeah.
So when you say someone is homeless, then you're they don't belong anywhere. So I think it's becoming more mindful of these words. And I use examples too of unlearning. Unlearning is probably harder than learning. And I've had to unlearn. If you look at my education, it's very British education from Kenya. And in the British language, would use words that were very rude and almost like aggressive towards LGBTQ communities, or I'm using words like Oriental, and I've had to unlearn that. Even as a DI director, I'm constantly unlearning, and I think that's when we create empathy and you see, oh, how is my language actually affecting that person in a deeper sense? So,
Well, getting back again to that fateful night in the library, I brought up an example there of this an old song by famous jazz artist, and I can't think of it right now. It's not Dinah Washington. Ella Fitzgerald, that's the one.
Ella.
Yeah, that it ain't what you say, it's the way how you do it, which originally is the walk your talk
Yes.
kind of routine. And I like to think of it as, tain't what you say, it's the way how you say it. So a lot of vocabulary is using terms that could be taken lots of different ways, depending how you say it. Either you say it with a point on it and stick it right in, or you, hey,
Yeah.
surprise.
Yeah.
Or you're using it as, well, that's the only word I know to describe the
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it has to do with people recognizing what's the motive behind that word. How
Yes.
are they using it? Why are they using it?
Yes.
As opposed to as soon as you hear the word,
Yes.
the horns go up and the battle starts.
Yes, and I believe that's the collaboration between intention and impact. So as you are being conscious of how that person is using that word, it's also the good to think of how the words you're using also affecting that person.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're trying to create, especially when we look at the history that we have in the United States and how systemically it's designed to put minorities in, to put them down and not to bring them along. So when we continue to use, let's say, certain words, it's already there systemically. And it's better if we as a community take that first step through language, and then the equity work that we're doing, let's say with the race equity audit, that then is the systemic effect. I think to me is I see not them, it's togetherness. It's like we are all in this. There's no turning back. Like we're here. It happened. It's now that we're here. How are we meeting each other? And that's a very difficult conversation. Being able to realize, for example, because I migrated from Kenya, I'm here. I'm able to have this conversation with you, but we didn't start when the gun went off and we're like, on your mark, get set, go. We didn't start the same. How do you turn around and have empathy, let's say, for the disabled partner that you see running next to you that's not able to catch up with you, or the minority young lady that is working very, very hard, but the mothers could not afford college? How could you see that person in a more humane way and then bring them along, because you can and you have that power to be able to do that? I think that's the part that is hard, because not everyone views injustice the same way, or that when it's on your mark, get set, go, then I need to take care of my family, and I don't know how this is my thing. And sometimes I feel that in Kenya when we're thinking about how do we take our army and it's going to go to Sudan and Somalia, and this is on. So these are the part that it becomes, how are we as a world and not just as Beverly? I don't know. I think that's the aspect of belonging.
Well, it's the real part of the problem that just about everybody in this country has got ancestors who were a minority at one time.
Yeah.
And if you go way, way, way back, I always like to you thought that at the time they were thinking we should have German as our national language because there were more Germans than anything else. So even though most of the colonies were English. So the history of this country is one minority after another.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the reason they're minorities is because there's only a few of them
Yes.
that first got here. And now it's such a mixed mess, you can't hardly tell what the backgrounds are. But at one time, you could always spot them by some characteristic. And I think what has to start happening is recognizing that we're all some sort of a minority. And one of the ones that surprised me, I was looking up the demographics for the city, and there's more women than men, so I'm a minority.
No, it's true. And that's why I think we're starting to gravitate towards you saying socially disadvantaged. Because minority, again, it's also saying that somebody is minor or that they're not, that there's something less than the other person. So I think socially disadvantaged is more inclusive. So I think that's something we're trying to bring into Beverly, is to use the right language as well, as we are being more inclusive of the other minority groups that have come before. Yeah.
Well, believe it or not, we've had half an hour of fun.
That was good.
And
thank you. We're good together.
And now that you're starting this program, I think you wanted to say something about what your programs are and your turn.
So thank you. Thank you everybody for enjoying this half hour with George and I, as your DEI&B director for the City of Beverly, would like to invite you to engage with Mayor's DEI&B office more. And we have wonderful programming coming out. We have our LGBTQ Pride Raising Ceremony on June 8th. And Juneteenth coming up on June 15th. So we look forward to seeing you there. And thank you so much, George, for having me. Okay. And BevCom, great work. Thank you.
Yeah. So obviously we haven't touched on all things.
Yes.
I've got a long list of stuff that I think that I would like to discuss, and would like to invite you back sometime in the near future and continue this discussion.
It would be an honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And as always, if you've got any comments, at the end of the credits is my email address. Send me your comments. And if you have some thoughts you'd like to express, there's room for you here at the table. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.